Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. For our Chinese-speaking audience, I will say 欢迎收听道可道. So, Richard, we are now talking using our usual modality, our usual format, which is online. And it's nice to see you, but I have to say it was much better to see you in person, as we had a chance to do just last week. Mm-hmm. It's funny, Richard and I have interacted in person a number of times over the years. I think we're mostly acquainted with one another online because through this ongoing reading group in classical Chinese texts that we interacted most. Mm-hmm. And most of the podcasts are recorded online. However, what you are about to hear today is an episode that we recorded in person in a hotel near Union Square, Conference Center near Union Square in San Francisco, California. Mm-hmm. And
The Westin Hotel,
yeah, with a live audience. And it was held in conjunction with a conference of professional philosophers. So most of the audience were professional philosophers, people who are specialized in philosophy. And moreover, most of them were specialists in Chinese philosophy. So we were, I think, safe to say, a little bit intimidated, both because the experts were in the room there to call us out if we made a mistake. I mean, I have to say, speaking to my colleagues, I think many people in the field listen to the podcast. So I think we should be no more nor less intimidated. But somehow just seeing the eyes of these longtime friends and colleagues and knowing that misattribution or, a mistaken description of someone's view might be called out immediately could be more intimidating.
Yeah, it was a room full of really great scholars of Chinese thought, and I was very impressed, and it was quite humbling. And fortunately, I was a moderator, so Justin, I think you were under more pressure, so I was happy to pass that pressure to you for that occasion. Yeah. But some really impressive names. I'm not going to name them because then we'd have to name them all. And the room was pretty packed, and it was basically full. And yes. I thought they were running out of seats, so that was also very nice to
30
see.
seats, almost all filled. So yeah, we must have had, at least 27, 28 people. Pretty remarkable. Better than we expected, for sure. And it was so meaningful and gratifying for us to see friends and colleagues there and to have a lively discussion, which you are now about to hear. Just one observation, Richard, one sort of surprise, I have to say, is that before we even began recording the conversation, I warned them, we don't have this kind of flowing manner of speech that we might seem to on the podcast because our audio engineer, Lena, edits out some of the filler words, like when we pause too long to say or right? That kind of thing. And then, according to my friends who were in the audience, we proceeded to deliver an almost flawless performance with very few filler words, suggesting to me that something about the presence of a live audience makes us more disciplined. When we're just sitting in front of screens and behind microphones, talking to each other casually, we're willing to start and stop sentences and pause and that kind of thing much more freely when we're on stage, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that it seemed like they enjoyed it. And yeah, you never quite know, how things are going. We've recorded around 20 episodes. And I think you've mentioned also that like after you're finished, you're like, oh, I think that went well, but you just never quite know, how well the episode went. But it was nice to hear that most people seem to have enjoyed also the experience of sitting there. And we do have a Q&A session at the end as well. So I think that also contributed to some of the liveliness or the energy of the conversation.
Yes. So let me just kind of reiterate something Richard has said to give people a peek behind the scenes. Basically, as long as we've been doing this podcast, I myself have always thought after we're done recording that the discussion, while fun, was less focused, disciplined than I imagined. And then yet somehow by the time it's released and the music's been added and they've edited out all those ums and uhs, it does sound better than it had been in my imagination. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm just a tough critic or what have you. In any case, the topic that you will hear about is a debate between Confucianism and Buddhism. And we don't have, neither Richard nor I have a great deal of sort of research expertise in Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. So we really wanted to bring in someone that we saw as a kind of very respected expert in Chinese Buddhism, and that is Jenny Hung. She is our guest. Richard will introduce her at the beginning of the next segment. Mm-hmm. So she's, I think it's safe to say, not 100% on board with Buddhism, but that's fine because I'm not 100% on board with Confucianism, and yet we were each assigned our tasks. I was assigned to defend the Confucian criticisms of Buddhism, and she was assigned the task of rebutting those criticisms. And I think we took them very seriously. And so we had a very lively discussion. We're both two gentle souls, so it wasn't a vicious debate, but it was nevertheless a debate. And I think there's a certain part of the audience that does enjoy a good debate about fundamental issues. So we hope you'll enjoy this one. So again, the topic is Confucianism versus Buddhism, or more specifically, two well-known Confucian criticisms of Buddhism. That's what you will hear about after the intermission music.
All right, so we are back, and we are really happy to be joined today for this live recording here in San Francisco with Professor Jenny Hung from University of Hong Kong Science and Technology. I've known Jenny for maybe over 10 years now. I think we were introduced before she became a philosopher officially. She was doing a PhD in physics, which she also finished. That means, I think, also means she's pretty smart, and she was very impressive when I first met her. But she said that she really wanted to get into philosophy, and we had a mutual friend, Professor Kim Chong over at UST. And anyways, I thought, Jenny should definitely be doing philosophy and be doing philosophy of mind, which she was very interested in. Jenny is an expert in Buddhist philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of mind. She has a book with Oxford University Press under contract. It's called Between Buddha Nature and Emptiness, the Peak Era of Chinese Buddhist Philosophy. Jenny has also published some really impressive articles in top journals like Oxford Studies. Yeah, we're very happy and very pleased that you're here. Hi, Jenny. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you, Richard, for a wonderful introduction.
Thank you, Jenny. I always thought that you would be the perfect person to have as one of our very first guests when we finally dip our toes into Chinese Buddhism. For a long time, I've seen myself as doing catch-up work in Buddhism. This is sort of open secret, I would say, in the field, that if you work in Chinese philosophy, at least in the English-speaking world, either you do Buddhism or you do everything else. And my graduate school training was clearly on the everything else side. So it was after I graduated, after I got my PhD, that I started assigning myself Buddhism classes in order to teach it. And I always found it much easier, frankly, to teach Indian or South Asian Buddhism than Chinese Buddhism. It gets so complicated and so metaphysical, I would say, once we get to Chinese Buddhism. But Jenny writing is very clear. I remember, Jenny, we first met at someone's tenure party, one of those sort of embarrassing ones where they rent a party boat and we go out in the water. And we had this long discussion of no self. And I was just so impressed with how clearly Jenny was able to articulate the doctrine of no self and even acknowledge some weaknesses or disagreements with the Buddhist view. So there was a certain kind of intellectual integrity there that I quite appreciated. So we're delighted to have you. I wanted to mention just quickly, there's one thing that many people in the English-speaking world may not know about Jenny, which is that her Chinese name, I'm going to give Mandarin pronunciation, my apologies to Jenny and her family who are primarily Cantonese speakers. Her Chinese name is Zhenru, true thusness, or tathata, right? Very important Buddhist term. So it seems like in some ways that you might have been predestined to be a Buddhism scholar. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your origins and your name.
Yeah. So my father is a Buddhist, and when he thinks about what kind of name I should have, she thinks about some comfortable name to pronounce, which sounds good. And then it should be a female name because Ru has the female character. So he thinks Zhenru should be the suitable name, but he actually doesn't think about ontology, Buddhist metaphysics at all, and he doesn't have a plan about what I'm going to do in the future. He doesn't expect me to be a philosopher at all.
But it is a very interesting coincidence that it worked out that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember finding out when I was young that Justin referred historically to this Christian martyr who sacrificed himself for this important Christian cause. You know, back in the 80s, when you looked your name up in a name book, it said Justin means justice and honesty. I remember taking that very seriously, that I should be concerned with politics and justice and try to at least have some virtues such as honesty.
I should intervene and say, my name, the origins of Richard. My mom named me after a road that she saw after she moved to the U.S.
Yeah.
She just found it's just Richard Road. That's all there is. I'm sorry. Yeah.
It wasn't that she.
No, I think it was just she saw the word and
it had a good sound to it.
Yeah. I do have a Korean name, Kim Tae-il, but anyway, that's a complicated kind of origin. But my English name Richard, just there's not much there.
It's only slightly better than my friend who named her child Cirrus because she saw an ATM with the word Cirrus on it and thought that was a nice name. All right. So here's our topic. We're going to look at two criticisms among many of the Confucians' level against the Buddhists. And I have lots of reasons for doing it this way. First of all, I should just say to our listening audience that we are at a conference of professional philosophers, and professional philosophers like debates. They like criticisms. They like to weigh pros and cons of arguments. A little bit of combat, maybe, although neither Jenny nor I are very combative. Another reason, however, is because in my view, you don't really understand a philosophical worldview in a kind of thick, robust, multidimensional way until you know something about what animates the philosophers to theorize about their particular issues in the first place. In order to know what animates or motivates their views, it's very helpful to know what views they take themselves to be arguing against. I also find that in some ways, you don't understand what's interesting, adventurous, controversial about a view until you know what views they're arguing against. So I'll speak now just to the audience of professional philosophers here. My experience reading John Rawls, this kind of great liberal thinker of the 20th century, was that it came across to me as a lot of platitudes, a lot of sort of obvious, uncontroversial truths. And that's in part because I wasn't fully appreciating that John Rawls was arguing for views over and against utilitarian ones, libertarian ones, maybe sort of more radical socialist ones, and so on. And so I want to do something similar with Confucianism and Buddhism. I want us to have an understanding of where they disagree, where the points of friction are. So in order to do that, we're going to look at a variety of criticisms, and we have a lot to choose from, by the way. So there is a long-standing tradition of debate between Confucians, Taoists, whom we're leaving out of this particular discussion, and Buddhists in Chinese history. Sometimes there were sort of annual formal debates with representatives of each tradition, such as in the Tang Dynasty. There is a very long and interesting literature that we sometimes now call Buddhist apologetics, where Buddhists respond to well-known criticisms that have been echoed, repeated again and again over the course of history. There's a lot, actually, if you read this literature, it gets complicated very quickly. Disagreements about whether they have compatible cosmologies. There's a lot of argument about whether Confucians, by denying karma, deny that there's any causal order whatsoever. So you can imagine it gets technical and difficult quickly. But as usual, as people who are mindful of our audience, we're looking for useful points of entry into the debate, and we landed on two. One is what we're going to call for now the Buddhist selfishness charge or criticism. And this one is perhaps the most well-known, the most widely repeated, and yet the most under-theorized criticism. So you see it, many Confucians suggest that Buddhists are selfish in one way or another, but for some reason there just isn't a great deal of literature. There isn't a lot of discussion now of what that means and what it amounts to and how we can sort of spell it out. We're going to finally do that. We're going to finally try to spell it out a little bit and give the Buddhists a chance to respond. And then the second criticism is going to be about what Buddhists call unconditioned compassion, which, at least on a certain Confucian view, is a kind of compassion that enlightened Buddhists should adopt, which is, at least as they see it, the Confucians see it, not compatible with special relationships, with family relationships, close friendships, and that sort of thing. So those are our two criticisms, the selfishness criticism and a criticism of Buddhist unconditioned compassion. So I'm going to use my usual Neo-Confucians as my spokespeople, as my representatives for these two Confucian criticisms. They come from the Song Dynasty. I'll tell you more about them later. Jenny, Professor Hung, has landed on a very useful foil or interlocutor here from the Buddhist tradition, Zongmi. And I wanted to give Jenny a chance to introduce Zongmi.
Yes, so Zongmi, who is called Guifeng Zongmi, is actually before Zhu Xi, whom we were going to talk about. And Zongmi is a Chinese Buddhist philosopher of the Tang Dynasty, and he is a disciple of Shen Hui, who is the Chan patriarch, and he is also the fifth patriarch of the Heze tradition within the Southern Chan Buddhism. Beside that, he's also the fifth patriarch of Huayan Buddhism after Chengguan. So the reason that I choose Zongmi to reconstruct his response to the criticism of Buddhism as raised by Zhu Xi is that he provides a complementary account of all three Chinese traditions, including the Taoist tradition, the Buddhist, and the Confucian tradition. He talks about different levels of conventional teaching, and he classifies different levels of Confucius teaching as belonging to a kind of conventional teaching. And through Zhongmi's ontology, there is a twofold ethical system which we understand why sometimes Buddhism is regarded as selfish, but instead it is not selfish when we talk about the ultimate level. And these are the reasons that I choose Zhongmi as one of the philosophers to respond to Zhu Xi's criticism of Buddhism.
Yeah, I think of him as a somewhat more moderate Chan-style Buddhist philosopher. So he's trying to find ways of integrating more conventional ethical views, making some room for conventional virtues and maybe moral rules understood as rules of thumb and not as universal exceptionless rules. So he's, sometimes I worry that the Confucians are making a bit of a, relying on a caricature of Buddhism that comes primarily from these really radical Chan sects, and Zhongmi's not from that group. So it's, if we want a sort of charitable reading of Buddhism, Zhongmi's the right one.
And Zhongmi had studied a fair bit of Confucianism and like the early Confucian texts, as I read it. And so he was actually sympathetic to a lot of Confucian teachings. Isn't that right?
Yes, this is exactly why Zhongmi has chosen. Zhongmi is really friendly to Confucian philosophy, and he thinks actually it is very useful in promoting ethical actions. But for Zhongmi as a Buddhist philosopher, it is not the most effective, but it is still regarded as one of the effective tools to promote ethical actions.
Yeah, great. All right, so let's begin with that first criticism. Let me start by giving you a kind of rough outline of how the criticism will go. I have some passages to share, but we'll get to those in a second. Let me just start with the kind of rough version. So if you read a lot of Neo-Confucian philosophy beginning in the Song Dynasty and thereafter, you'll see them say quite often in one way or another that Buddhists, just in virtue of their sort of ideological, religious, theoretical commitments, are selfish or self-interested. The Chinese term is often si. There are other ways of reading that term, sort of concerned with their own private good. Sometimes they say li, kind of profit motivated. And there are many ways of cashing it out. And I think, in fact, the Confucians have a number of criticisms in mind. So the one that will be quite obvious to people in their time is that if you are a serious Buddhist, then you probably think, it turns out not everyone thinks this, but you probably think that at some point in the course of your spiritual development, maybe after many lives and rebirths, you will need to leave the family and become a Buddhist monk or nun. And the word that's used to describe the process of becoming a Buddhist monk or nun is literally chujia, lead the family. And so that looks like a very selfish thing, right? To abandon your parents and siblings and so on for the sake of what? Well, it looks like it's for the sake of overcoming your own personal attachments and thus your own suffering. So there are various ways of spelling out this or cashing out this criticism of Buddhists as being selfish. We're going to focus on one that to me is quite intriguing. It goes more or less like this. It suggests that for Buddhists, insofar as they do adopt ethical precepts or norms, it seems like they understand them instrumentally. They understand them as means to an end. And what end? That end, at least on a certain uncharitable reading that comes from the Confucians, is personal salvation, achieving nirvana, overcoming your own suffering. It looks selfish in that respect. So just to think back on some of the things that most of us know about Buddhism, I think a lot of people listening to this podcast will know at least this much about Buddhism. Buddhism has 4 noble truths, right? The first 3 all have to do with personal suffering. So the first noble truth is truth of suffering, that your life in general is suffering. The second noble truth is about the causes of suffering, the cumulative causes of suffering, understood as desires or attachments. And the third one is about the solution to the problem of suffering, which is to get rid of those desires or attachments in order to overcome the suffering. And then the Buddhists introduce what they call the Eightfold Path, part of which are ethical norms describing or prescribing ways of living, ways that you ought to live, diet, and so on. If you, at least on a certain reading of the 4 Noble Truths, it looks like the ethical norms are introduced as a means to the elimination of your own suffering. And so that is one way of spelling out the criticism that Buddhists are selfish.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But what do you think about Bodhisattva? They help others. They commit to saving all sentient beings before attaining Buddhahood. What does Zhu Xi think about it?
Okay, that's right. So Jenny's making a good point here. The way I just described the criticism presupposes that it's all about ending your own personal suffering and entering nirvana yourself, achieving a kind of salvation for yourself. But that's actually, for most, I'd say almost all Buddhists in the Chinese-speaking world over the course of most of Chinese history, Buddhist history, that's not actually how they understand themselves. Most Buddhists understand themselves as belonging to this so-called Mahayana or greater vehicle tradition, which doesn't see as its endpoint achieving a kind of personal salvation and entering nirvana personally. Instead, it sees as a kind of endpoint bodhisattvahood. I shouldn't say it's quite the endpoint. The goal is still ultimately to become a Buddha, right? But on the way to becoming a Buddha, you become a bodhisattva. And an important feature of becoming a bodhisattva is that you take the bodhisattva vow. That vow, at least on most readings, explicitly says you commit to eliminating the suffering of all sentient beings before you yourself enter nirvana. And that actually sounds like an extremely altruistic goal.
Now, the way you put it, though, leaves it open, like why you're pursuing the liberation of others. Is that a precondition for your achievement of nirvana? Or is it just, valuable in and of itself? So it seems like I'd be curious how that's going to play out. So if there's independent weight or value given to helping others find liberation, or is it all ultimately derived from the orientation toward self-liberation?
Yes.
And I wonder if that's addressed at some point.
Yes, Zhongmi's answer is a twofold foundation of ethics, which I think can apply to answer the question of the selfishness objection raised by Juicy.
Yeah. So we like to read passages. So maybe I'll read our criticism of Buddhists first, and then we can talk about Zhongmi's answer. Is that okay? So yeah, this is all very interesting. Let me just start by saying this much. As long as I've been studying later Confucianism and these Confucian Buddhist debates, I've met Buddhist scholars who say, oh, you're Confucians. They're so confused. They don't understand that their opponents are Mahayana Buddhists who believe in this kind of bodhisattva ethics. And I think, well, that can't be right, because all of my Confucians basically went through a kind of early rebellious, hippie or punk rock stage where they were Buddhists and where they sort of, rebelled, and they embraced this very countercultural view. And including the two Chinese Confucian philosophers I'm going to read to you today, Lu Xiangshan and Zhu Xi, both more or less contemporaries in the Southern Song. They both went through a Buddhist stage. They know their Buddhist literature very well. So I think they've got to have the bodhisattva ethics in mind when they make this criticism. And so one thing that's nice about Lu Xiangshan is he does seem to explicitly acknowledge the importance of bodhisattva ethics for Buddhists, and nevertheless thinks that there's still a kind of, in some profound or deep or important sense, a kind of selfishness embedded in the religion. So let's maybe take a look at Lu Xiangshan. So this is the passage that I will be putting on the show notes, as usual, on Warp Weft and Way, the blog where we keep all of our extensive show notes. And the passage comes from a very famous letter by this Song Dynasty Neo-Confucian philosopher, Lu Xiangshan, otherwise known to some as Lu Jiuyuan. And the letter is called the Letter to Wang Shunbo. It was quite well discussed by his contemporaries, and it became sort of representative of this literature of Confucian criticisms of Buddhism in later history. So here's the key part I want to read for you. I have 3 paragraphs on the website, and really it's just the first 2 paragraphs I think that I'm going to read to you because they're the ones that address this problem most explicitly. So the first paragraph begins more or less with this observation that Buddhists want to transcend. They want to transcend this world. Sometimes, by the way, if you study a lot of Confucianism and Buddhism, you'll hear people say, well, Confucianism is a more this-worldly philosophy, and Buddhism is more as a kind of philosophy or religious worldview that aspires to transcend this world. That might be right, and Lu Xiangshan seems to be willing to endorse some version of that claim, although he reads that claim in a more subtle way than many do. So anyway, here's Lu Xiangshan trying to more or less spell out the selfishness charge against Buddhists in his own distinctive way. He says, when Buddhists consider the life human beings live between heaven and earth, they say that there is a cycle of life and death. So that's another way of saying samsara, right? So there's this cycle of life and death that we're stuck in. Transmigration and rebirth, and suffering and affliction. So they understand life here and now as one of process of living and dying, transmigrating and being reborn, and suffering. They regard it as a state of extreme suffering, and they seek a way to avoid it. According to them, those who have attained the way and achieved enlightenment realize that originally there is no life and death, transmigration and rebirth, or suffering and affliction. This is why their teachings claim that the cycle of life and death is the great affair. The so-called resolution to become a bodhisattva also concerns this one great affair. This is the foundation upon which Buddhist teachings have been established. This is why I say they concern what is personally beneficial and selfish. So you see, he acknowledges that there's this commitment to become a bodhisattva in Buddhism as Lu Shangshan experiences it in his day and in his sort of social world. Nevertheless, he says they're all concerned just with this one great affair, and that affair is escaping the suffering of samsara, of life and death. This is the foundation upon which Buddhist teachings have been established. He goes on, I'll read another paragraph for you. Because Confucians are concerned only with righteousness and the public good, they seek to put the world into good order. All right. So he's sort of saying, we Confucians, we're ethics first, right? We see ethical values as worth instantiating for their own sake. So we want to put the world into good order. Because Buddhists are concerned only with profit and selfish good, they seek to flee the world completely. Although Confucian teachings talk about what is without sound or scent, which is his way of saying, talk about some kind of transcendent realm. Although they talk about what is beyond method and embodiment, their guiding aim is always to put the world into good order. All right. Although Buddhist teachings talk about saving all sentient creatures, even those yet to be born, that's the Bodhisattva vow, their guiding aim is always to flee the world completely. So his point seems to be that you can be a Confucian and have some interest in transcendence, so long as your guiding aim remains an ethical one, putting the world into good order. And you can be a Buddhist and talk about being nice to people and being compassionate and helping others and instantiating Buddhist virtues, so long as your guiding aim is ultimately to flee the world and overcome suffering. It's selfish in that sense, he seems to be saying. So here I find it helpful to think of some analogies just to sort of wrap our minds around it. It's a rather abstract point that he's trying to make. So let me try this one on you, and maybe there are ways for fine-tuning this analogy. But let's say it's like this. You have a very, very wealthy uncle, all right? And I myself am an uncle and not a father, so I don't have any children myself. I'm not wealthy, but I'm very into my nieces and nephews. I see them almost as ersatz kids. So maybe I could be this uncle someday. So a very wealthy uncle who wants his nieces and nephews to be good people. And so you more or less take the hint from your uncle that if you somehow prove that you're a great philanthropist and really compassionate and kind to others, you will inherit that wealthy uncle's estate someday. So you ask around and you figure out that your uncle really loves, Habitat for Humanity, which is a philanthropy we have in the United States. They build houses for otherwise homeless people. And so you volunteer for that, right? Now, let's say that you volunteer for a long time and you become very good at Habitat for Humanity. There are kind of two versions of this thought experiment we could go with. One says that all along you cynically are more or less trying to impress your uncle so that he will be convinced you're a good person and write you into his will and you can inherit his money. There's actually there's a less cynical version, which I think is still potentially problematic, which says, no, in the course of doing this work for Habitat for Humanity, you come to appreciate the inherent value of this work, this philanthropic work. You enjoy building houses for the homeless. You enjoy seeing the fruits of your labor. You enjoy seeing families now housed. You now begin to see this as something worth doing for its own sake, right? In some sense. Let's say that all those things are true. And yet, in some sense, you still see inheriting your uncle's estate as what justifies your philanthropic activity, right? That's, I think, what Lu Shangshan is trying to suggest, the position that Buddhists find themselves in. They might have an ethics, they might appreciate some sort of the attractive or appealing features of that ethical life, but still they understand that ethics as justified in terms of its capacity to provide you with a kind of salvation. And that's a kind of selfishness. All right, so that's my attempt to do justice the most I can to Lu Shangshan.
Okay. Thank you, Justin, for the wonderful example illustrating that maybe the Buddhists would have a selfish ultimate goal when they do ethical actions. So here is Zhongmi's plausible reply. So actually, Zhongmi does not really has a reply to Zhu because he's earlier than Zhu. But now I'm reconstructing his theory in order to provide a reply to Zhongmi and Lu Xiangshan's objection to Buddhism. So before we look at the foundation of ethics proposed by Zhongmi, we have to understand a little bit about his basic ontology. So he thinks actually Zhongmi belongs to the Tathagata-Gaba tradition, which proposes Buddha nature. And Zhongmi in particular proposes the idea of the true mind of original enlightenment. And for him, this true mind is one single true mind, which is undifferentiated. It is not to say I here have one true mind, you over there has another true mind. Instead, there is one single true mind that is undifferentiated, which is the ultimate reality. So we are derived from the ultimate one true mind. And if we practice self-cultivation or practice the Eightfold Path, then we can reunite with this ultimate true mind. So this idea actually originates from the Awakening of Faith, which is a famous sutra in China, and also the Perfect Enlightenment Sutra. And so, Zhongmi actually has provided a systematic examination and interpretation of Confucianism, Taoism, and various Buddhist schools under his ontology. He thinks if the school proposes the idea of the true mind, then this school is regarded as higher than others because it is closer to reality. And for those who do not propose the idea of the true mind, they may be inferior, but they may also be conventionally true and because it is effective for promoting ethical actions. So after understanding Zhongmi's ontology, we go on to the twofold foundation of ethics. So there is elementary teaching versus ultimate teaching. So when Justin talked about karma, rebirth, the ultimate escape from the infinite cycle of rebirth, all these belong to elementary teaching. As we already know, the Buddhism in general proposes the idea of karma, saying that if I do something bad in this life, then maybe I will reborn as a pig in the next life, or a cockroach, or something undesirable, maybe a worm or something like that. So if I do good enough things, then I accumulate good karma, then I can become a heavenly being after I die. So this is a kind of system that has karmic retribution. So we actually do not want to be involved in the karmic retributive system because there are a lot of sufferings involved. So the ultimate goal is to escape. So as Justin has mentioned, escape from this suffering karmic system and to attain nirvana. So this is emphasized by the Hinayana tradition. So our ultimate goal is to attain enlightenment, namely arhathood, and then to cease the activities of the five aggregates, namely the mental and the physical activities, such that we do not go to another rebirth anymore. But this is actually, for Zhongmi, not the ultimate picture. So, I have to briefly explain the two notions of truth here. So when I have a sentence talking about something that is effective, for example, it leads to successful practice and is acceptable to common sense. For example, I say, yesterday I went to a Korean restaurant. This sentence is acceptable, it is understandable in common sense, and you know what to do for me. For example, I'm already having a Korean food yesterday, then you want to lead me to a Japanese restaurant today because you don't want to repeat letting me have Korean food. So this is effective. According to the Buddhist tradition, these kind of sentences are conventionally true, but not ultimately true. What is the problem with it? The problem is with the word I. So I say, last night I went to the Korean restaurant. So I use the word I as if there is a person who persists over time. Right? There's the same thing. That is a substance. That is a person that persists over time. Actually, this sentence does not reflect reality. So a statement is ultimately true if and only if it corresponds to facts, and neither asserts or presupposes the existence of any conceptual fictions. But the word I or the name Jenny or the name Justin are all conceptual fictions because we find it effective in referring to a person over time. In reality, there are no persons over time. There are no self. This is the ultimate reality according to Buddhism. So under this picture, there is the ultimate foundation of ethics, which is differentiated from the conventional foundation of ethics. The ultimate foundation of ethics is based on the ontology, which is the true mind, which is undifferentiated. So if it is the case that we are all the same substance, then there is no justification for any selfish or self-oriented desires, because when I help you, I'm actually helping myself. We are all the same mind. So it is like when I stretch my leg, my arm will not feel jealous about why the arm should help the leg to stretch it, right? It doesn't have that kind of self-oriented considerations because that is just one body. Similarly, a Buddhist, when he gets enlightenment, he truly understands the reality of undifferentiated true mind, according to Zhongmi. And therefore, he will not have any self-oriented desires, let alone selfish desires. This is the foundation of ethics at the ultimate level. But actually, Justin is right in noting that there is the conventional level or elementary level of teaching according to Buddhism. Namely, there is karma, there is rebirth, there is the frightening fact that karma is suffering and we have to escape from the infinite cycle of rebirth. So all this makes a lot of sense in Buddhism too. So Buddhism does not dispel the elementary teaching. They say, actually, it is effective. It is good. It is good for human beings because it pushes you guys to act in a moral way. It is even more effective than the ultimate teaching. The reason is that the ultimate teaching is difficult to grasp. People don't feel as if you guys are one with each other, right? There is no such grasp of reality or experience of reality. So you have to practice. Sometimes you have to practice in order to understand how it feels to be united with reality. So the conventional perspective is necessary. According to Zhongmi, he even says, well, we need that kind of teaching because it is difficult to attain enlightenment and elementary teaching is easy to follow. And it provides a selfish but efficient reason for moral actions. Well, Zhongmi acknowledged that kind of delusionary but yet effective teaching. But we all realize that this kind of ontology or this kind of teaching is incompatible with the theory of no self. So as a Buddhist, we need to understand the ultimate perspective, preferably in the first place. Before you start the Eightfold Path of Self-Cultivation, it is preferable that you really understand what reality is. That's why Zhongmi proposes sudden enlightenment followed by gradual practice. So you first attain sudden enlightenment first. And then after you understand that there is no self and you understand there is the true mind and understand all of us are only one true mind, then you start self-cultivation. And when you practice all kinds of moral actions, there is no such thing as selfish or self-oriented considerations because you have already attained sudden enlightenment. Well, so I think this is the model how I answer Zhu Xi or Lu Xiangshan's criticism of Buddhism, saying that Buddhists are selfish. My answer is yes, it is in the elementary teaching that Buddhists are indeed selfish. But if you follow Zhongmi's advice to attain certain enlightenment before starting your cultivation, then you will not have any selfish or self-oriented desires to practice your ethical actions.
Yeah, that's great. So that's very interesting. And just in the interest of making sure that we're all on the same page, we and the listeners, I think it's probably useful for me to take a stab at summing up your view, and you can correct me if I've somehow not done it justice. But basically, for Zhongmi, he's willing to concede the criticism to a certain extent. He distinguishes between elementary teachings and advanced teachings. One of the important features of an elementary teaching is that it teaches conventional truths, things that aren't actually true, but sort of true from if we adopt certain presuppositions that are widely shared. like the fiction that there are selves. One of the stories that often gets cited when trying to distinguish between elementary and ultimate truths is, I think it's the Lotus Sutra, which tells the story of head of household whose kids don't understand the danger of fire. Somehow fire is too abstract a concept for them. They've never encountered it before. So the household catches on fire, and so he's trying to convince his children to leave the house. And for them, it's this abstract threat, so it's not a problem. Somehow, the life of suffering that you encounter in samsara is like that. It's an abstract threat that you don't quite grasp, just as the kids don't understand the danger of fire. So the head of household essentially makes up a story and says, you have these really great toys that are outside. If you just run out front and leave the gates of the house, you can play with these really great toys. And those are supposed to be, in some sense, analogous to conventional truths. It's tempting to say, well, those are just lies. How are those conventionally true? But anyway, they stand in, at least they're analogous to it. I mean, they may not have to be an example of conventional truths. And so Zhongmi seems to be suggesting that there is a kind of selfishness, but it's operating in the same way that the head of household's conventional truth about toys being outside is operating. It's motivating people to adopt the Buddhist path, start studying Buddhism, and so on. But ultimately, when people have the right understanding of reality, there is no distinction between their conventional self and other people's selves in the first place. So it's incoherent, say, from a bodhisattva's point of view, to say that they are motivated by self-interest, right?
That's exactly right. So Zhongmi has the idea that if you get sudden enlightenment, you will not be selfish anymore because you have already realized that reality is undifferentiated and you are one with the rest of the world. You are one with other sentient beings. And there is no selfish reason for retaining happiness just for yourself. You will seek for happiness for all other beings. It is a very natural, spontaneous, and rational action for you to consider all other people.
So you no longer have selfish reasons, but do you also have non-selfish reasons since there's really no other beings ultimately? So it seems like you can neither do selfish or non-selfish actions. Well, given that there's just no distinctions. I mean, so it seems like, you can't act egoistically or altruistically.
Well, you don't think about ethics anymore because you just consider it as very natural to do things that enhance these organic systems' well-being, right? So you want this whole world to be better. And this is the reason. It is not because you see individual suffering. It's not because of your agency to reflect upon what is the appropriate thing for you as an agent to act when there is such a situation. So ethics is not based on rationality. It's based on a more natural, spontaneous reaction, which is based on the deep understanding of oneness of reality.
That's so interesting, and yet it's such a big conceptual leap. It's kind of hard to wrap my mind around it. I see the appeal of Richard's point that although it's like in some ways an elegant response to the selfishness criticism, still one might worry that it takes away sort of the basis of value for our more altruistic or other-oriented virtues, that there's something sort of admirable about certain virtues insofar as you understand other people as other people and care for them nonetheless. Maybe that's one way of filling out Richard's point. I have another point, maybe it's too quirky or something, but I think actually one thing that we've been doing all along here, and maybe this is okay, is we've been presupposing a certain understanding of selfishness, according to which to be selfish is to be motivated by your own good as such for your own sake, right? That is, what makes you selfish is essentially the content of your desires and motivations. So I see examples of this kind of argument about selfishness when I hear people apologizing for whatever nice thing they want, like a higher salary or whatever, or ambition. You meet someone who's like really ambitious and maybe they'll say, oh, I admit that, I work really hard and I want to be promoted to manager or dean or what have you. But it's not for me. It's because my family really needs this boost in salary or what have you, right? Even in the Confucian tradition that I work on, you see Jushi, for example, and his students often talk this way. They say, oh, so-and-so, this other student, seems to be so driven to pass the civil service exams. Doesn't that bother you, Jushi? Doesn't it bother you, teacher, that he's so career-minded? And Jushi will say, well, it does, but then I found out his parents are very poor, And so the idea seems to be like you're selfish insofar as you care about your own well-being for your own sake, as opposed to caring about it for the sake of others. That's one way of understanding selfishness. But there's another model of selfishness that I think of as like the company boss model. All right. So imagine you have a boss who's really devoted to a company, right? And let's just stipulate for the sake of the argument that the boss really cares about the company, not his or her own like success. They're just really, I mean, let's imagine it's like a philanthropic organization or a university, right? It's not that they just, want the Coca-Cola company to do well. They want their university to thrive and they care about it and they're all in. There's a sense in which they're truly altruistic because they put in some sense their company, their institution, their university before themselves. They see it as having more importance than their own well-being. But they're a terrible, callous, indifferent boss who treats their employees terribly because they don't engage in any perspective taking. They're always just, driving their employees to work like crazy and punishing them if they don't have the same sort of self-sacrificial ethos and kind of work ethic that they do. That's a kind of selfishness too. It doesn't consist so much in the content of what motivates you. It's not that you're motivated by your own self-interest as such for your own sake. It's a kind of selfishness that has more to do with the procedures you adopt when thinking about what goals you should have. You're not taking into account other people's interests in some way. And yeah, I don't know. I think maybe there's some way of spelling out the Buddhist criticism as being a selfishness of the latter sort. It's all about salvation and not about ethics,
Very good. So thanks for Richard's and Justin's examples. I am thinking about another example of a PhD student or student who pursue his very long-term studies in order to be a professional and then serve society using his profession. So he needs a lot of effort, self-discipline, control, and manipulation of time, etc. So is he selfish in some sense? Is he trying to achieve the highest goal he can achieve in his life? Is it selfish from a Buddhist perspective? I think it is not necessarily so. The reason is, when you think about yourself as being one with the world, it doesn't mean you have to get rid of all the plans or you have to be very carefree, just flowing around, going to the park, enjoying yourself. It doesn't mean that you should get rid of these kind of considerations about yourself. Instead, you can think of yourself as part of this wonderful differentiated oneness with a lot of good things, and you want to maximize the goodness in terms of these present cause and conditions, right? There is a physical organism, there are some mental activities, there are some talents, characteristics that the so-called conventional person you now have. So how to maximize the goodness you, so-called you, the conventional you, have in order to bring the maximum goodness for society? You can plan for it. You can think about your strengths, right? Oh, I am good at being a physician. Or I'm good at being a philosopher. So you can very hard on achieving the goal of being a physician for many years, for example, 10 years, or you have careful, dedicated plan for achieving this goal in order to flourish this very conventional being such that it can maximize the goodness of society. So I think from Buddhist point of view, it doesn't necessarily mean just wandering around without any plans or just spontaneously reacting to current situations. Instead, you can be enlightened being and at the same time carefully plan for your future, so-called the conventional you, your future, to achieve the maximum good.
Yeah, that's helpful. So maybe we can think of it in terms of analogies to the body. This is something that both the Confucians, after the introduction of Buddhism, and the Buddhists themselves, this is the kind of analogy they often use. So imagine you're the finger on a larger whole that we call the whole body. Well, as the finger presumably cares about the welfare, the interests of the whole body, the finger is a part of that body. So in a sense, of course, it follows naturally that the finger will care about its own well-being, but only insofar as it's part of this larger whole. Similarly, for us as conventional selves, we're part of a larger body that is the universe, and so we'll care about all the parts of that universe, including ourselves. Maybe you could even argue we have better access to, have more control over what happens to our future conventional selves, and thus we're right to worry more about those.
All right. Yeah, so that was really great, Jenny. So I think we actually, at this point, need to turn to our second criticism of Buddhism, which is from Jushi. And Justin, you want to quickly introduce this, and then I'll read the passage?
Yeah. So Jushi is a contemporary of Lu Shangshan, You listeners have been hearing a lot about Jushi recently. The last 2 episodes were about Jushi. We had episode 18 with our wonderful guest, Steve Engel, who, by the way, happens to be in the room with us. And by the way, that one, for what it's worth, did really well. There were lots and lots of downloads, either because we put the word metaphysics in the title, that seems to appeal to people, although they might be disappointed by the kind of metaphysics that we covered, or it's Steve Engel's sonorous voice that somehow... But anyway, that was... so if you want to hear more about Jushi, you're welcome to listen to episodes 18 and 19, which we had a lot of fun doing. So this is Jushi's criticism of essentially a view that he takes from Buddhist moral psychology. Buddhists talk a lot about compassion and loving kindness, and they make a distinction between what we could translate as unconditioned compassion and conditioned compassion. And essentially, it's supposed to work like this, at least on Jushi's reading. Unconditioned compassion is the kind of compassion that's sort of left over. It's this general feeling of wanting good for the world that you have when you've managed to eliminate all attachments, when you have no particular attachments, no emotional investment in certain outcomes, and so on. That general feeling of happiness and goodwill toward all living things or all things in general is unconditioned compassion. Conditioned compassion is the sort of thing that comes to us quite naturally as human beings. We care about the people that we share a roof with, that we live in a home with, that we share lives with, our close friends, our colleagues, and of course, most importantly, our family members, our parents, and so on. Those are all kinds of compassion that we developed conditioned upon having certain relationships and life experiences with people. So Jushi, as he often is doing in passages that people like to quote Jushi in his discussions with students, and that's what this is. So Jushi has a student who suggests that Buddhist conditioned compassion is essentially the only door to love of family members and close friends and so on, and thus the only door to close and meaningful relationships with others. And so insofar as Buddhists are trying to jettison or get rid of conditioned compassion and just encourage people to adopt unconditioned compassion, maybe that's not even compatible with special relationships. That's one way of interpreting the criticism, I think. Richard was going to read it.
Okay. Yep. This is from the Collected Sayings of Master Ju, translated by Justin. The teacher responded, "The Buddhists recommend unconditioned compassion. I can recall a place in a text in which the Buddhist author describes the great compassion that originates from the nature, which is unconditioned. This is because what the Buddhists call compassion arises in the absence of any conditions and simply is care directed at all things. As for the cause of caring for one's parents, they rashly take that to be subject to conditions. And so they abandon their parents and fail to nurture them. But if they encounter a starving tiger, they will sacrifice their bodies in order to feed it. How could this possibly be morally correct?" And here, this passage seems to connect it to a number of early Confucian passages like Mengzi 7a45, where there's this differentiated care. You should care more about your parents than other humans, and you should care about humans more than other creatures or animals. And so the Confucians certainly take this as this kind of partial concern as extremely important and pivotal for maintaining social human relationships. And so obviously Jushi is very offended here. I'm not sure about the starving tiger bit.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah, so one funny thing is Jushi actually, because he went through his Buddhist phase, remember his hippie phase or his punk rock phase when he experimented with Buddhism, experimented with meditation and self-abnegation. And anyway, because he went through that phase, he read a lot of Buddhist literature, and he found apparently a passage where it seemed to recommend that good Buddhist would sacrifice his own body to save a tiger, a good Buddhist monk, because after all, there might be circumstances in which he would care more about the well-being of the tiger than himself. And so Jushi is suggesting, well, that's strange. So you would sacrifice your own life for the sake of a tiger, but then you have this kind of weird apathy and indifference to this kind of low-grade compassion for your own parents that roughly comparable to the compassion that you have for the whole world. You should have strong, special, really emotional attachments to your parents. And that's one thing he thinks that unconditioned compassion denies us. Yeah. All right. So we should hear Zhong Mi's would-be response.
Yeah, thank you so much. So before I use the Zhong Mi's theory to respond, I would say something personal about the passage Richard has just mentioned. I think for Buddhists, our understanding of this passage of feeding a starving tiger would be to just illustrate that there exists some kind of passionate being that they can sacrifice their body to serve the tigers. And this is like an exemplar of how compassion can be extended. But I don't think for Buddhism this should be followed or this should be learned. Well, the idea is actually it is not rational at all for us to sacrifice our body to feed a tiger, because it just feeds the tiger for one meal. But what about the next one, right? So the calculation is the outcome is more negative than positive. So your parents will be very sad and your relatives will have a huge loss. And then you have lost the opportunity to use your life to serve other people, right? To contribute to society. So you lose the whole bunch of wonderful good qualities that you can exhibit or you can manifest. In order to serve the tiger for just one meal, I don't think it is rational at all. So I don't think for any Buddhist schools, they would say you should practice sacrificing yourself to a tiger just for one meal. This is my personal response.
Can I concede that point quickly? I admit, as someone who reads Jushi a lot, there's this kind of like, I don't want to say he has no sense of humor because that's not quite the right word, but there's this way in which he doesn't appreciate how the Chan literature, and Chan, by the way, is the Chinese pronunciation for Zen. So we're talking about essentially Zen Buddhism. He doesn't appreciate how Zen Buddhism sometimes just says things for shock value, like to kind of jolt people and rattle their assumptions in some ways, and not necessarily to endorse these views. And that happens quite often, in fact. And I think, as you say, this idea that you should sacrifice yourself for a tiger, that's really just meant to kind of propose this radical idea to make you wonder, to make you think, why am I so attached to my own body and my own self and self-interest and so on? Yeah. He kind of fails to appreciate that. He's a humorless reader of the Zen literature sometimes.
Yeah, so it makes you reflect upon your value system and your attachment, but it is not recommending you to follow the exact way these kind of people are doing. So now I'm going to talk about how Zhongmi would reply to the idea of the objection of unconditioned compassion. First of all, I would like to state that Zhongmi extends the Buddhist classification framework, 判教, to include Confucianism and Taoism. Of course, Confucianism and Taoism is regarded by him as lower than many Buddhist schools because he's a Buddhist. But what is the criteria of classification? As I observe, he has a pragmatic consideration when he classifies things. First, of course, is that if a teaching can reveal the ultimate ontology of things, then it would be regarded as higher. If it is more differentiated from the reality, then it should be regarded as lower. But the second one is about encouragement of ethical actions. So if a theory is effectively encouraging ethical actions, it should be regarded as higher. And if it is not effective, then it should be regarded as lower. So what about Confucianism? Is it an effective way of urging us to do ethical actions? Well, for Zhongmi, the answer is no. So Confucianism is considered less profound than the elementary teaching of Buddhism. So the elementary teaching is the karma system with rebirth, with kind of punishments if you do bad things. Because you have bad karma, you reincarnate into a pig or a cockroach, whatever. So Zhongmi thinks this is more effective than the Confucian teachings. But why? Why is the Confucian teaching not effective in promoting ethical actions? The reasons may include, first, its ontology does not accurately reflect reality, and second, its ethical implications are limited. So here is my interpretation of why the Confucian ethical system may have a limited understanding or function for promoting ethics. So think about you having plenty of love toward your parents and plenty of love toward your spouse. But things are transient. One day they die. So you cannot get rid of the sadness of losing your parents. So there are several years or even a decade of time that you are immersed in the sadness feeling that such that you cannot really function well and you cannot eat well and sleep well. So you have to go to the physician and try to find a way out. So I see Buddhism as a therapeutic tool to help people alleviate from that kind of immersive sadness from losing your loved one or significant ones. So regarding the question of whether we should treat our parents the same as an ant, as they are both sentient beings, My answer from a Buddhist point of view is no. So even if both of them are sentient beings, we have much more causes and relationships and conditions. So both of them are conventional beings. So I am conventional being, my parents are conventional beings, but there are the group of physical and mental activities that have closer relationships. And so-called my parents, these 5 aggregates, have a much closer relationship with me than 5 aggregates here, right? So I actually are more treatment depends on cause and condition. So for the example of parents, conventionally speaking, your parents care for you throughout your life. And given this relationship, you're best positioned to care for them, even if you are a conventional existence. So these all depend on cause and conditions. So you should not react to an end the same as your reaction to your parents. Also because your parents expect closer care from you, unlike a stranger on the street. So I think even Buddhism advocates unconditioned compassion. It does not advocate unconditioned care. So these two things can be different. Even if you are compassionate to all kinds of sentient beings in the world, your action, your treatment to them can vary. So that's why my interpretation of Zhongmi's classification of different theories or different traditions is to say Buddhism supports differentiated care rooted in unconditional compassion. So if you understand reality as one, you regard every sentient being as one with you. But practically speaking, you react to different conditions in different ways. So you react to your parents very differently from you react to an ant. So while Buddhism encourages a monastic lifestyle, which is really true, in my opinion, Chinese Buddhism has already shifted towards caring more about their parents, because in many sutras, which emphasizes sila, which is how a bodhisattva practices their sila, their ethical conduct, filial piety is mentioned. So that is why when Indian Buddhism is transmitted to China, the idea of filial piety comes out, and that it influences Chinese Buddhism to the extent that this kind of emphasis, like taking care of your parents, is written in later sutras in Buddhism. Before I end it, I want to mention a little bit about the differences between Confucianism and Buddhism. So Confucianism is more empirical, understanding our human nature, right? Studying our nature, and then they say, okay, there is family structure. We all have families. So they put emphasis on human relationships and family relationships. But Buddhism is a little bit more metaphysical and religious. The picture is wider. They include different kinds of beings, not just human. There are heavenly beings. There are ghosts. There are meditative beings without parents. They don't have any parents. They are just born in the air, right? So I don't know if cockroaches are taken care by their parents, but I'm sure the spiders are not taken care by their parents. So Buddhism includes more kinds of living beings. So they recognize various forms of humanity, and they consider family as just one type of social system. It's not like Confucianism, who just focus on human or human nature. So for Buddhism, they acknowledge non-human animals and other social structures that do not involve parental care. And also, that's why they propose the growth of unconditioned compassion with the idea of differentiated care, which can be extended to those structures that are not having any family structures.
Yeah. So I don't know about you, that's a very interesting answer. It also raises lots of difficult questions for me. So it seems that the upshot is Zhongmi recommends that we adopt both unconditioned compassion and something like, love of family members and close friends and so on. I just wonder what kind of psychological state or disposition is that, where you're able to adopt both of these sort of attitudes or dispositions at the same time? I mean, we probably can't really unpack all of the psychological difficulties here in this particular episode. But I think basically the Confucian worry at this point is that as a Buddhist aspires to achieve the Buddhist ideal, understood as sort of radical non-attachment, that more conditional care, that more family-oriented love and compassion is just going to have to fall away. It's just hard to see how family life, family attachments are compatible with the kind of non-attachment that Buddhists aspire to. So one of Lu Xiangshan's complaints in a section that I didn't read is the very end of the third paragraph that we'll have on the website. He says, nevertheless, their teachings were not developed with the aim of preserving these ethical values. He's talking about the Buddhists. And so whether or not it is preserved is of no importance to those who are far advanced in practicing their way. So he's worried that advanced Buddhists don't have good reasons to adopt traditional Confucian virtues that are more family-oriented and interpersonal.
Well, very good question, Justin. So this is my own personal response. It may not be related to Zhongmi's or other Buddhist ideas. So my idea is, given that you are born into a family, you already was given a pair of parents, and then you are kind of trapped into a specific or unique cause and condition, right? So you, as a conventional existence, you already are better positioned to serve your parents than serving an ant or serving a bystander on the street. But after your parents pass away, what is the picture? In my opinion, if a practitioner of Buddhism is of high spirituality, their romantic attachment would be less. So I cannot say it totally eliminates the romantic kind of attachment, but I would say they care more about sentient beings as a whole. When they interact with many other sentient beings, for example, they are a teacher or they are a physician, then they are more devoted to help these sentient beings which they interact to alleviate their sufferings, but they would place less emphasis on their own romantic relationship. It's like they are less attached to their special, unique romantic relationships. Therefore, some of these so-called higher level spirituality Buddhists would choose to be nuns or monks in order to fully devote themselves into the contribution of society.
Yeah. Wow, Jenny, you are an exemplar of Buddhist debate and discourse. So one thing Jenny just did more or less was say, your Confucians are right, but only about part of the sort of domain of value or part of the truth. That's a classic Buddhist move. They always sort of offer themselves as offering the more complete picture. It's an attempt to be complimentary, right? To say, oh yeah, you Confucians, you got something right. It turns out that it's just a conventional truth and it doesn't capture the whole picture. So anyway, if I understand you correctly, you're saying the Confucians do a good job of capturing a certain dimension of value. That dimension of value has to do with personal relationships. But then what happens, as you say, when your parents pass away, your family members die, you lose your friends and so on, still there are many sort of concerns we have about how to live a life in accordance with the way outside of the context of those relationships. And Buddhism has the better answer to those. Yeah. It's supposed to be a compliment to the Confucians, but somehow it still hurts a little. It's like, yeah.
All right. That's great. I think, we're at this time where we had planned to open up for Q&A. I have many other questions, but I'm going to kind of restrain myself. And I think we should go for the audience because that's part of the joy of being here live. I saw Steve's hand first.
So thank you all. This has been great fun and just what we should be doing at a philosophy conference. So I want to shockingly speak up on behalf of the Confucians in this debate.
For the listening audience, this is Steve Engel, whom you heard just 2 episodes ago, defending Zhu Xi's metaphysics. So yes, that's why we shouldn't be surprised. Yeah,
exactly. So as I understand it, the Confucian criticism isn't that Buddhists know that they're being selfish, right? It's that they are being selfish. And it seemed that Jenny's response, right, was 2-part, that there's this a conventional level of truth, and in those terms, they are being selfish, right? But in terms of the ultimate truth, they're not. And so at least if we follow Zhongmi and have the sudden enlightenment first, right, then their subsequent practice is sort of inoculated from being selfish because they've already understood the truth of no self. But the Confucians are going to deny that. They're going to deny that that is ultimate truth. And so as long as Buddhists are wrong about that premise of the argument, then it seems like the Buddhists have convicted themselves of selfishness because they acknowledge that at the conventional level it's selfish.
Yeah, but that is a very good question. And I find difficulty in understanding how sudden enlightenment is possible without prior practice. So I would say my understanding of enlightenment is to be acquainted with reality. So it is like a non-conceptual experience such that you have a subjective feeling that actually there is no such discrimination between yourself and the rest of the world. So from my perspective, there should be some meditation before you achieve this stage. But that is my understanding of Buddhism. That's not Zhongmi's understanding. I think Zhongmi's understanding of certain enlightenment is purely from a philosophical perspective. Like, if you really analyze the fact that there is no such thing as a substantial, unchanging, persisting self, such that everything is interconnected and everything is derived from one single source. So all these are philosophical reflections, and you arrive at the conclusion of one single true mind, then there's no such thing as selfish considerations after your careful philosophical conclusion. So in my opinion, this is one way for these intellectuals to achieve enlightenment, but it doesn't really sound very effective for many others. So that's why Zhongmi says we should also propose the elementary teaching, because many of us cannot reach sudden enlightenment. It is not an easy path. That's why we have to introduce the selfish, frightening picture such that you guys will practice moral actions.
Thank you, Jenny and Justin. This is also a question for Jenny. I think you may concede too much to Justin or Confucianism. Even though myself leaning towards Confucianism, but I think one of the most attractive part of Buddhism is that it can actually allow people to cut the ties from their family, from the society, and let, either mentally or physically teach the Buddhism as a refugee. So in that sense, they don't want to be associated with the family or the society. It's that give them the mental and physical freedom to do so. And that, I would say, is one of the big attraction to many intellectuals too, not to mention to ordinary people.
I say, so you see this as something advantageous for Buddhism. So not to pursue too many familial responsibilities and not to be involved within the society with so many interactions. So it's like being more isolated from the world and the society such that you find peace and calm from your practice. Well, yes. So Buddhism has two stages. Roughly speaking, there is the Hinayana Buddhism and there is the Mahayana Buddhism. And during early Buddhism and Hinayana stages of Buddhism, the emphasis indeed is more on your cultivation, your practice of Buddhism, such as meditative practices. And the requirement for deep meditative practice is to go to an isolated place, such as a mountain, live in a temple, and then practice ethical rules, a very strict ethical rules such that your mind is very calm and you don't have a lot of things to do. So you practice deep meditation and you observe your mind, and then you understand transiency of mental states, and then you attain nirvana, personal enlightenment. This is the path of the so-called Hinayana tradition of the Buddhist practice. And indeed, many people think it is wonderful, it is worthy of pursuing because it provides you a way to escape from the many sufferings induced by society and by your family members. Maybe your family member is not treating you good, not having a very good relationship with you, such that you have the desire to escape from all these bad relationships. I also appreciate that kind of lifestyle. I think it is therapeutic in some sense, but I also appreciate the Mahayana style, saying that, well, actually, you don't need to escape from all these relationships in order to attain enlightenment. If you really realize that, for Zhongmi, for example, the world, the reality is one. There's no differentiation between self and others. There's no substantial persisting self. Then actually everything is empty and you don't really regard your suffering as that substantial, right? Your suffering, your problematic relationships, all are empty. So if you really understand emptiness from this perspective, then you let them stay here, you let them develop, and you let them go away. So all these things are like just happening as the cloud in the sky flowing. So you don't really mind the happenings of the so-called sufferings and happiness because all are empty. And if you reach that stage, you don't really mind going back to samsara and interacting with all the sentient beings. But I think there are two pictures, right? The first one is like, okay, suffering is real. I have to get rid of it. I have to go to an isolated practice meditation, achieve some mental state, like getting rid of my craving, my delusion, and my hatred, such that my mind is calm. That is one way. The second way is to acknowledge emptiness of all things, such that you don't really mind whatever situation you are in. And I think that is another way of alleviating one's suffering. So yeah, that is the basic picture. I think that can provide different ways for us to alleviate suffering.
Yeah, thanks Justin and Richard for organizing this panel and also present a very good summary for the Neo-Confucian critique to Buddhism. And also thanks Jenny for summarizing the possible Buddhism response to this. And I want to follow up the self-interested suggestion here. So Buddhism's strategy is not self-interest, because if we understand the things correctly, then we care about all things. We should care about all things because all things are united in certain forms. So it's like what Richard just now summarized, is that there's no difference between selfish and non-selfish action, or we may understand it in a quite different way. But if we understand Buddhism in this way, then what is the difference between Neo-Confucianism and Buddhism here? Because Neo-Confucians such as Jiang Jia, Zhu Xi, and also Wang Yangming, they also believe in the idea of oneness. They also believe that we should promote the well-beings of all things, including the nature. Yeah, not only about human beings, including the nature. So it seems both Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism in this sense talk about oneness, include promoting the well-beings of all beings in the world. So is there a difference only that they have different substantial understanding of what is good for all things in the world, but they both have a similar form of understanding of what's good here? Yeah.
That's a really tough question. And I find it often comes up actually when discussing the three great traditions in China, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. It's very tempting, especially among people who are familiar with later Confucianism, to say that in some way you can harmonize the three traditions. And this is one of the ways in which people are tempted to do it. So all I can do is gesture at the idea that there are answers in the later Confucian tradition. I'm not sure I can fully spell them out. But so basically, there are a couple of things to say here. First of all, Zhu Xi does think it's important that you get the sequence of kind of virtuous thoughts or achievements right. And he does say in various places that when you instantiate the virtue of humaneness or goodness or benevolence, this virtue which he associates with seeing yourself as one part of a larger whole, he thinks you first care for other creatures and then you feel that you are a part of the larger whole. He thinks it's very important to distinguish that sequence from the other sequence, which sees somehow your wholeness, your oneness with the larger whole as coming before this sort of care or compassion for other creatures. So that's at least a gesture at a kind of solution. The other thing is, in one of his most famous but difficult treatises known as the Ren Shuo, something like on humaneness, on this really important virtue, he seems to want to have it both ways when it comes to oneness. He denies that you should see yourself as part of a larger whole in one sense, but then admits that you should see yourself as part of a larger whole in another sense. And then later defenders of these rival traditions, like the Wang Yangming tradition, sometimes criticize him for it. But I think there's probably some relatively accessible ways of cashing out this idea that we can all get behind. So maybe what he means when he criticizes people who have the wrong understanding of oneness is that there are people who understand oneness in the sense of identity, like just in the same sense that I'm identical with myself, or that this cell phone or this bottle of water is identical with itself. He denies that. He does, however, accept that we are one in the sense that we're parts of a larger whole that somehow belong together, that we understand as organically as a whole. So oneness in the sense that my finger belongs to this body, that he can get behind. But he's worried that the Buddhists have some other confused sense of oneness, I suspect.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. So I want to start with a quick response to this gentleman's issue. So I think despite you can argue that both Buddhism and Confucianism subscribe to the idea of wholeness or oneness, I think the fundamental difference is that for Confucianism, ethical, family-centered ethical structure is primary. It's derivative from that oneness. Whereas this is definitely not the case for Buddhist idea. So this goes back to Professor Engel's comment, because in my opinion, this is doomed to be a failure conversation, dialogue, because Zhu Xi and Lu Xiangshan started from a very different premise from the Buddhist tradition. Because for them, the family-based ethical structure is primary, is part of the Tao. But for the Buddhist tradition, that the whole structure is based only on the notion of self. And unfortunately, the notion of self is just conventional. So think about, it's very easy to think about all this issue in terms of reincarnation. So according to the Buddhist tradition, all of us has been in reincarnation from the beginningness of time. And therefore, in this lifetime, somebody is my parents, but in the previous time, they're my friends. In the even previous time, they were, just street people. So in some sense, every one of us were family member at some point. So there's really no special part, to treat my parents in this lifetime in a very special way. So this marks a very important distinction between Buddhism and Confucianism, right? Also, finally, back to the issue of moral psychology raised by Justin just now. I like to say, in this lifetime, the ethical action is just like a play. We're all actors in this lifetime. So I happen to be born in this family. So that's my role played in this lifetime. So I try hard to play, to be a good son, just to be a very serious actor in this time. While at the same time, I realize this is just temporary. So after 2 hours, after the play ends, then I quickly assume another role, be another actor. So I think there's a switch, in terms of moral psychology. This is how the Buddhist tradition might say it's compatible.
Yes, right. For what it's worth, I find that analogy very helpful at explaining the sort of thing that I was struggling to wrap my mind around earlier, which is how you can adopt Buddhist unconditioned compassion and conditioned compassion at the same time. You do it through this kind of double-mindedness, which I see in some ways as echoes of Zhuangzi, but maybe I'm reading too much into it. The analogy is quite nice. So you see this life and the attachments, the family relationships you have in this life as like one version of play that will be reiterated again and again over the course of perhaps an infinite or anyway, a vast number of lives. So that's a way of both fully committing yourself to the role and yet still thinking of it as a role that you're playing. That's how you achieve a kind of double-mindedness with respect to your special attachments. I love that. I just love that way of phrasing it. I love thinking about it in those terms. I suspect at the end of the day, some Confucians are still going to say, well, then that's the wrong attitude to have toward your family members. You should be fully invested in your family members' well-being. You shouldn't just see it as that your role as a child or as a parent or a sibling or what have you as a part that you're playing.
Yeah, thank you for that discussion. I think I'm more sympathetic to the Confucian position, but I feel like it still has maybe more problems than have come out. The foundation of ethics ultimately, you could say it's selfish in that it's my family first and maybe my state first, maybe not, but my humanity over animals. And I still think, again, I think that's probably the best we can do with ethics, but I think it has still problems. And one of those is for people who are relatively in bad situations, not just people, things, right? So let's say somebody who doesn't have children or whose children die. On the Confucian view, we should take care of them, but after I've taken care of my family, right? It's always second. And that could work out badly in that how much effort do I put into my family first before I go off to these other people, right? Or animals, I feel like, are in that position as well. So yeah, the New Confucians will say you should take care of animals, but only once humans are all doing well. It seems like on those kinds of issues, at least the Buddhist position might be more appealing, in that there is this sense of, practically speaking, it makes more sense to take care of my parents, but everybody has equal worth. And I need to consider everybody's suffering as equal and animals also. So I'm wondering, if maybe on at least that kind of issue, maybe the Buddhism has the stronger position.
I did have that same question that you raised, Frank, about whether there's a kind of selfishness objection that still can be applied to Confucianism too, based on this kind of differentiated concern. I was wondering if one response they might offer is, but they think that this hierarchy of relationships fall out of like an objective Tao. So there's still this kind of objective moral order, which is independent of any individual person's will or subjective desires. And so you're supposed to conform to the objective good out there. And so that objective good orders or ranks the priorities in this way. And you didn't choose it. That's just how it came. And so since you're trying to conform to something outside of you, it's not selfish still because you're directed toward the good or something like that. Would that resolve at least I mean, of course, we can still debate whether they're right about the Tao, but then at least within that framework, the selfishness tension or challenge would be dissolved. Do you think that would work?
Like that theoretical response that would work, right? But I think the practical issue is still there, that it's not going to work out as well for people who don't have people to take care of them, right? As I think on a Buddhist position.
Yeah, no, that's just good worry, I guess. But the Confucian agent might be like, yeah, no, that does kind of suck. But here I am. This is what I've conceived to be the good. And so, yeah, I feel sorry for like the animal that I can't take care of because I'm just spending day and night taking care of my dying father. And so, yeah, it's not the perfect world, but it's not selfishness, at least. At least they could say that, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions now. If I could speak very broadly and crudely about them, it seems like they're pushing this line that Buddhism comes better equipped to handle these pressures toward more universal ethics. So sure, if you happen to have a family to take care of you, that's great for you. But what about orphans or the childless, or what about animals that don't have, it seems like in every case for Confucians, you put your own family and your own sort of intimate and personal relationships first. That leaves a lot of other people out in the cold. Buddhism has a better foundation by which to account for the reasons why we should care for orphans and childless seniors and so on. Yeah, someone wants to follow up on this. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up to Professor Perkins' question. If I remember correctly, Zhu Xi has this initiated this 相约 idea. So if there's an orphan from my neighbor, then no problem at all. It's the whole community that should work together to take care of that orphan. So in that sense, the Confucian tradition also has this kind of universal within a limited boundary. So I care the orphan next to my door much more than I care an orphan from the next village, right? That is their responsibility to take the orphan in that village. Yeah. So I think that wouldn't necessarily constitute a fair criticism of the Confucian idea.
Yeah. There's still a kind of safety net. Okay, great. Yeah. Well, so do we have any other questions? Yeah, one last question. Good.
The second passage on the handout, I think, between your discussion and Jenny's discussion, you've kind of shown one way in which the criticism launched there is in a sense misguided. But I'm wondering if there's a way that we can kind of reconstitute it, especially in terms of the contrast that's drawn there between this idea of jingshi and chushi, putting the world in order versus fleeing the world, right? I take it that the response is that in one sense, it's not a fair characterization, especially of the Buddhist view. But I'm wondering, again, if there's a way of, in a sense, trying to recast that, which gives it a little more bite. And so I want to just put this out there and see what your reaction is. And the thought would be something like, in what sense could they still be characterized as fleeing the world? If we think of this in terms of one of the fundamental Buddhist commitments in terms of avoiding suffering, there's a way in which, whether you think just in terms of personally or me, as part of the larger undifferentiated whole, from the agent's perspective, there's still a sense in which it's about avoiding something, right? Whereas when the Confucians, talk about bringing the world to order, they're speaking from a somewhat different perspective, which is that, for them, the fundamental problem is not suffering it's a problem, but it's not the fundamental problem, right? And so for them, there's a different kind of orientation to like, what is the challenge for agents in the world that looks like it's not focused in that same way of avoiding something that from the agent's perspective, you don't want.
Right. Yeah. That's a nice point. So there are lots of ways we could go with it, really. The idea is essentially the real contrast is between putting the world in order and fleeing the world. And basically, because the Buddhists understand all of their goals in terms of this kind of master objective or goal, which is to flee the world and to eliminate suffering, like the world isn't even the locus of value. And so there are all these other values that generally want to instantiate in life that have to do with, kindness and loving others, building meaningful relationships and stuff like that, which they'll just never be able to adequately justify or ground. Is that roughly the idea?
Yeah, well, something like that. It's just there's this different, you might say, less pessimistic take on what the fundamental problems are that makes it less a matter of avoiding or fleeing.
Ah, yes. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So that's right. So at least it's not the dour conclusion that it's all a matter of trying to flee the world. Right. So the Confucians have the better framework, the less pessimistic framework, the one that's just like less a matter of treating life and all of its complexity and its relationships as like diseases to be somehow avoided or minimized. Yeah, there's a really deep and interesting point there. Yeah, I think the Confucians would be fully on board with that. Okay, alas, I think we're give the sign off. Yeah, 感谢你的收听. We're adding now in Chinese, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.